how to do this, because I've been so involved with this for so many years. It's interesting to sort of take stock and step back. And I will only say, when I wrote one of the first papers on this, it was 1977. It's a long time ago, before probably most of you were born. And I sent it to a journal. Some of you know the story. I sent it to a journal to be listed, because in those days, before the internet, that's what you had to do. And the editor calls me and says, yeah, we'll list your paper, but there's a terrible typo in the title. It says stakeholder management, and we know you mean shareholder, so we'll change it. And I said, well, please don't. So stakeholder theory has come a long way since then. I get a lot of credit that honestly I don't deserve for this. I once said I was the only person to have written about this idea who did not claim to have invented it. In fact, I tried to show who did. And the origin story goes back to two places. First is at Stanford Research Institute in the 1960s. They published a report called a Business Intelligence Report. And in those days, when you did strategy, you forecast trends in the external environment, and then companies could think about how they could take advantage of or defend against those trends. And SRI had done this report in which they'd identified trends, and they'd organized it by consumers and suppliers and society and employees. I think there may have been one or two others in that. And as as we were told the story, they were trying to figure out, sitting around, trying to figure out what to call these groups that they had organized it by. And there was a woman, a technical writer, Marion Dosher, who said, you mean these stakeholders? And the people looked around and went, yeah, that's exactly what we mean. She knew the word as an old Scottish word that meant the stakeholder was the person who held the stakes in a gamble between people. And it's a very old word, and she sort of brought it back. Similarly, at roughly the same time, Eric Rinman, who was a Swedish organization theorist, wrote a book called Industrial Democracy in the Workplace. Rinman was really sort of the father of industrial democracy in Sweden, or gets credit for that. And he talked about the role of, in Swedish, I think the word was intressant, and this got translated as stakeholder. Rinman also spent some time at SRI, but I don't know exactly, we haven't been able to figure out exactly the connection there, and that would be an interesting thing to do. Giles Slinger did a PhD at Cambridge, and he sort of retraced the steps I had taken, and in a couple of papers, he argued that essentially I had screwed it up a little bit, and of course I had. He was right, and it was interesting for those of you who are PhD students. At his doctoral defense, I sort of walked in and because I'd been invited to be on the committee, and he was sort of terrified that I was going to be offended by him redoing what I had done. And of course, he did it better. So, all I could say was, great, that's terrific. And then Robert Strand and I wrote a paper in Journal of Business Ethics that traced the sort of stakeholder idea in the North countries. And to impart Juha Nasi, who was a great friend of mine before he passed away, who really embedded stakeholder thinking in the business schools in a number of the North countries, especially in Finland. What happened with the idea for a long time was, people sort of referred to it sometimes in the strategy literature. I showed up at Wharton as a postdoc in '76, and the stakeholder idea was sort of in the air at the research center I was with. Russell Ackoff had written about it in a book called Redesigning the Future. Eric Trist from the Tavistock Institute was at Wharton at the time, and Ian Mitroff was visiting there, and so we had a little seminar. I was the young guy sitting in the corner, quiet, about what to make of this stakeholder idea. And people would get to a point where they'd say, well, you know, this is normative stuff. We can't say anything about this. And I thought, well, you know, I just came from studying philosophy for God knows how many years and reading John Rawls' The Theory of Justice for how many years. And normative work doesn't bother me. So I think maybe I can do something with this. And I tried to, and that ended up being a book called Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach, which I want to tell you, I didn't think that the stakeholder idea was the most interesting idea in the book. I didn't see why anybody would think this idea was controversial. Look, businesses have always and will always create and sometimes destroy value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people, and money. That's what they do. That seems to me just to be a pretty basic business 101 kind of idea. Now, granted, I was not burdened down with being trained in business, because I had come with a PhD in philosophy, grown up on a farm, and I didn't know anything about business. I was just trying to figure out what they did. And it looked to me like that's what they did. They created and sometimes destroyed value for these stakeholders. So I didn't think this was controversial at all. My wife read the draft of the book. She was a Wharton MBA, and she said, well, you know, this is pretty common sense. You're probably never going to be able to make a living at this. And well, she's wrong about the living, but she's right about the common sense thing. And so I didn't really understand the sort of politics of business schools or any of that stuff. I didn't know, for instance, you weren't supposed to write books, because in philosophy you have to write a book. And so, you know, in a series of just serendipitous moves, I write this book. I call it Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach, not Stakeholder Management. People have said to me about this book, which has got, you know, some ridiculous number of citations, like 45,000 or something. I mean, it's something really ridiculous. You know, they've asked me, what's it like to write a business bestseller? And my response is, I don't know. They only printed 2,000 copies of the book. So either there's some worn out copies in some libraries around the world where the print is coming off the page, they've been read so many times, or no one's actually ever read this book and they've just referred to it. And I think probably the latter is more true. It's certainly true. I thought I was a strategy guy. I thought I was teaching strategy at Wharton. I thought I had something to say to people who did strategy. And this was right at the time in the early 80s when, you know, Porter published Competitive Strategy. Jay Barney's doing Resource-Based View a little bit later. And essentially nobody cared about the stakeholder idea. The people who did care and sort of took me under their wing, if you like, were the people who did social issues and management, CSR, and business ethics. And so they became the people I sort of hung out with and worked with for a lot of years. And it wasn't until the late 90s that the stakeholder idea began to get published in you know, occasionally Strategic Management Journal, and we managed to start a section of the Strategic Management Society on stakeholder theory. So that led, I think, to some misperceptions about stakeholder theory that persist even to today. And I want to talk about that in a slightly different terms, because I think today people talk about, at least in the US, they talk about stakeholder capitalism. And we see that really going on all over the world. The World Economic Forum, the Business Roundtable in the US, and many others have sort of come out in favor of this. And they're really, to my thinking, four interpretations of stakeholder capitalism, as I see it. And I want to endorse one of those, not the other three. The first one is one you see in newspapers all the time. It says, look, this stuff is not serious. Businesses aren't serious about this. This is what's called virtue signaling. I'm just, businesses are greenwashing, or whatever color you happen to be washing this with. They're not serious about it. And they're going to say a lot of stuff, but we know, the people that believe this, we know business is really about the money. Push comes to shove, business is about the money and profits and shareholders and all that sort of stuff. So that virtue signaling, greenwashing, we're not serious view is one way to see stakeholder capitalism. And I think a lot of people who are, I would say, trapped in the old narrative of business, who can't get out of that narrative, would see it that way. Second way is to say, look, this is just CSR. Maybe companies mean it, like a lot of companies mean corporate social responsibility, but this is just new words for old ideas. Now, my take about that, and I got to be careful because I see some friends in the audience who are world-class scholars and leading thinkers about CSR. I've never been much of a fan of CSR because I've thought it's too often separated from the business model. It's too often bolted onto this idea that business is about making as much money as possible. And while my heart's in the right place, I mean, all their hearts are in the right place, I think the idea has outlived its usefulness in a way. And I think my take on what companies are saying and doing is that it's far more, for the most part, than just CSR. Third idea really comes from what I would take as something like the World Economic Forum, etc. And it's about this idea that it's about top-down elites. It's about getting CEOs and government officials and, the movers and shakers of society to sort of committed to designing society that'll work better. My take on that is, well, maybe that'll work. I don't see much evidence that we've ever had much success with that. And I want to think about stakeholder capitalism in a different way. There are pluses and minuses to all three of these, but there's another way to see this, and I think it's to see it as a change about the business model. What a business does is it creates value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people, the money, and it tries to figure out how to get those interests going in the same direction, how to harmonize the interests of those groups. Harmony's the good metaphor because in music, the notes are different, but in harmony, they sound good together. You might have to make trade-offs with stakeholders, but if you don't look for win-win-wins, you won't ever find them. All you'll find is trade-offs. And so I think this what I would say is this is about a different way to think about business. It's about thinking about stakeholders not just in a this business transaction, but thinking about it in relationship terms. Now, when you think about things in relationship terms, it's fundamentally different than thinking about transaction after transaction. If we're in a relationship, there's a presumption by both of us that that relationship's going to continue. There's a presumption that we actually care about each other. And there's a presumption that we don't really need to keep score every day. If I were to go down the hall to my wife's office, we've been married for 44 years, and say, hey, babe, I think you owe me 3. You're up 3. I'm pretty sure I know what the answer to that would be. And since she's a 2nd-degree black belt in Taekwondo, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be good for me. Why? You don't keep score every day. I mean, look, you might have to someday say, this relationship isn't working for me. But if you keep score every day, you don't really have a relationship. There's no difference in personal relationships, your relationships with your stakeholders. Companies that do this well actually care about their customers. They care about their employees. And they see it over time. The so-called great resignation of people resigning during the pandemic. The companies that, actually care about their employees and have stood by them in the pandemic aren't having much problem with this. And so it's really seeing this relational view of the world, which is important. So the idea is that today, I think we need to see the stakeholder theory as engaged in the business model and in a revision of the narrative. Now, in a recent book called The Power of And, Responsible Business Without Trade-offs, Bobby Parmar, Kirsten Martin, and I suggested that there are kind of 5 ideas that revising this narrative of business needs to be built on. And we use and as the most powerful word in the English language. It's about purpose and profits. The idea that profits are evil is a silly idea. Look, I need red blood cells to live. The purpose of my life is not to make red blood cells. Businesses have to have profits to live. They got to have profits at what our finance colleagues tell us, the weighted average cost of capital. To think otherwise is just not to understand how business works. But to say that that's the purpose of business is just a category mistake. It's just a logic mistake. Purpose is something else. Entrepreneurs don't start a business because they're trying to make as much money as they can. Most of them don't. They start a business because they're on fire about an idea. If they don't start one because they're on fire about an idea, they're probably not gonna succeed. So we need purpose and profits. We need, and those things are not juxtaposed with each other. It's not am I sacrificing profits for purpose? No, we know from research that purpose-driven firms can perform better. They don't always perform better, but they can perform much, much better. The second dichotomy that we need to get rid of is stakeholders versus shareholders. In a lot of textbooks, a thing I wrote gets juxtaposed with Milton Friedman and shareholder value. And since Milton Friedman's kind of one of my heroes, I've never really understood that. Friedman thought ethics and business had to go together, as do I. Now, the way he said it's not the way I would say it, but shareholders are stakeholders, and they're important. And it's just they're not the only thing that's important. And so that's the issue here. They're connected to each other. How you create value for customers depends in part on how you create value for the others, and vice versa. And understanding the interaction effects there is, I think, one of the places where we need much more research, etc. So purpose and profit, stakeholders and shareholders. We need to see business as a societal institution as well as a market institution. Business needs to be a part of, not the solution, but part of the solution to issues like poverty and inequality and global warming and the pandemic, as we've seen. And so we can't just analyze market forces, as many of our business school colleagues want us to do, and think we're done. It's market forces and societal forces. Of course, market forces are important, but it's both. We need to see, number 4, our full humanity. We need to see, look, if this is going to work, stakeholder capitalism works because people are creative. They invent new stuff. They invent new ideas. And we need to see ourselves as able to literally invent vocabularies that solve our problems. Think for a minute about how we got from swinging in the trees on the savannas down to having things like iPhones and Zoom meetings and that sort of stuff. Well, how did we go from one to another? Well, we had to invent language, and we had to invent some vocabularies that would solve some problems. And then we had to cooperate together to make those things real. And that view of a human being, not as greedy little bastards out trying to do each other in, but rather as pro-social animals who can cooperate together, who can figure out how to create vocabularies that can solve our problems and cooperate together to do that. That's what human beings are, to me. And this idea that all we do is, compete, and it's nature red in tooth and claw, and that's an old idea in evolutionary theory that I don't think is very useful anymore. And finally, we got to put ethics and business together. The idea that business ethics is a contradiction or an oxymoron or a short course or whatever the jokes are these days doesn't help much. So stakeholder theory, stakeholder capitalism, as I see it, has these sort of 5 key ideas: purpose and profit, stakeholders and shareholders, society and markets, humanity and economics, and ethics and business. And whatever we call it, whether we call it conscious capitalism or stakeholder capitalism or impact investing or ESG or whatever the hundreds and hundreds of ways of thinking about revising capitalism is, it's got to deal with these five ideas. Now, just briefly, there's some barriers. The barriers are what I call the separation fallacy. Saying that business and ethics don't mix. It comes from a tradition called positivism that's rampant in business schools, that says the only way to do research is to do truth as a function of what you can empirically demonstrate to be true. Now, philosophers killed this positivism in the 1950s, 70 years ago. I was surprised to find it alive and well at Wharton, and not just Wharton, in every business school I've ever been to. This mania for thinking we can do purely descriptive empirical research is, again, I would say, a logic mistake. In a wonderful book, which is very readable, a philosopher named Hilary Putnam wrote what was the end of the fact-value dichotomy, in which he argues that, look, facts and values and interpretation and theory are all kind of entangled together. For instance, how do you know a particular piece of data is data that's relevant to a theory if at least part of a theory is not already entangled in the data? The best example of the fact-value dichotomy is the use of stakeholder itself. When I call someone a stakeholder, I'm making a normative claim. I'm claiming they have a stake. So framing it as a question of stakeholders is already to do something, yes, descriptive, yes, normative, and yes, theoretical, and yes, empirical at the same time. And so trying to sort that out and quote, because that's what science does, is I think a mistake about what science does. And it's a mistake that holds us back from asking more interesting questions, it seems to me. Behind this is what I would call a fallacy of dichotomous thinking. It's thinking about its business or ethics, its purpose or profits, its stakeholders or shareholders. It's theory or its application. It's rigorous or it's relevant. These dichotomies don't lead us anywhere. What we need to do is use our creative imagination to figure out how we get past those dichotomies. Another barrier is what I've called the business sucks narrative, this idea that business is morally questionable. We find that deep in societies around the world, and I won't rehearse the arguments. It's a paper in the Journal of Humanistic Management that I published in the last year or so that I actually gave 25 years ago about that, etc. And then there's what I would call, after 5 years as editor of JBE, a sort of business school publication fallacy. And this fallacy is the idea that, I think many of the problems that business school professors work on is the problem of how do I get my research in top journals, rather than a problem that somebody actually cares about in the real world. I don't think there are many executives, when I've said this to some CEO friends of mine, they just laughed at me, who are standing by waiting for the latest issue of the journals. Boy, I wonder what those management people have figured out now. And that's a problem. We need to be, with our research, connected with real business problems, with real societal problems, which business can make a difference. So maybe I'll just stop there and see if there are questions for